One thing worth saying about the next election is there's sometimes an assumption that it gets easier for the opposition after a big defeat to come back. If you look at history, that's actually not always true. So, Labour had a worse defeat in 2015 than it did in 2010, had a worse defeat in 1983 than it did in 1979. One card which Labour will be able to play next time round is don't let the Tories back in. So we've got a question here about the next election cycle. It's from George Waters. Hello, George. And he asks, what is the likely trajectory of the UK electorate? With mass tactical voting this year, Lib Dems doing rather well, and the Greens coming second in around 60 urban seats, and I'd add the 4 million plus votes to reform, have we seen a fracturing of the vote? PR seems inevitable at some point. Will we reach a point where it's impossible for a single party to command an outright majority?
I'm struggling to already recover from the previous election. So turning ahead to the next election cycle, I'm not sure I agree with our listener, George, that PR is inevitable. Certainly not by the next election.
No, it's definitely not inevitable, partly because obviously a party that wins a big majority has a vested interest
Yeah.
in not changing the system. It's worked out
Turkeys don't vote for Christmas.
rather nicely for them. Look, I think two things are true. Look, there was a time in British politics when people said, look, we're in this era of fragmentation and parties may never win an overall majority again. People used to say, look, the Conservatives will never win an overall majority again. They're just appealing to too narrow a section of the electorate. Boris Johnson went on to win an 80-seat majority. People said Labour would never be in government again. Clearly they were wrong about that. Keir Starmer won almost the biggest majority in the party's history. So, volatility can work in different ways. It doesn't mean that you're seeing the irrevocable decline of the two main parties. Parties can still win big majorities on a relatively small share of the vote if their vote is efficient and if they're winning seats in the right areas. But the other thing that's true is, voters are shopping around more. They're more promiscuous. They are happy to change from party to party within different electoral cycles. You had Lib Dem voters in 2010 who switched to UKIP in 2015. Voters are much less tribal and partisan than they used to be. That in the long term is going to create more fragmentation, more surprises, more volatility.
And probably more demand from what was perceived to be a fairer electoral system, if you believe that.
Yes. I mean, look, the electoral reform debate will rumble on, but I don't see how you get change unless you have leaders who are committed to it as a real political project. It's something that they genuinely believe in. And let's remember, I think you'd probably need a referendum to change the voting system. The last time we had one, the public rejected it. It's the AV referendum in 2011 when First Past the Post won by a very comfortable majority. So this debate will rumble on, but I don't think there's anything inevitable about the demise of First Past the Post while the two main parties can keep winning majorities under it.
No, I agree. And also, I mean, George touches on it here. He says with mass tactical voting. And I think that's key also because, yes, the Greens did very well and the Lib Dems did very well and Reform did well. But particularly with the Lib Dems, a lot of that was tactical voting. If we did have PR, we might see a completely different result because your vote would sort of matter more. And, time and time again, we've heard particularly pundits during an election campaign say, well, these parties, particularly those smaller ones, can more or less say what they like because they know they're not going to get into government. So I think we wouldn't necessarily get the same result that we've just seen if we had PR.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think one thing worth saying about the next election is there's sometimes the assumption that it gets easier for the opposition after a big defeat to come back. If you look at history, that's actually not always true. So, Labour had a worse defeat in 2015 than it did in 2010, had a worse defeat in 1983 than it did in 1979. One card which Labour will be able to play next time round is don't let the Tories back in. They will be able to say to left-wing voters or liberals who didn't vote for them this time around, maybe they voted for the Greens in protest, maybe they didn't vote at all because they're unenthusiastic about Keir Starmer. They'll be able to say, look, if you like what we've delivered, and if you don't want a government that's going to do things you don't like, then vote for us. And the problem for the Tories is how toxic their brand is at the moment. The reason tactical voting against them was so effective is because of how widely disliked they are. So, they've got a huge political challenge. It's not just about winning back voters from reform, though they definitely need to do that. It's also about detoxifying their brand so that people whose main motivation is currently to stop the Tories winning are more relaxed, and are perhaps more willing to risk not voting Labour.
But, if a week is a long time in politics, then certainly 5 years is. So, finally, the latest New Statesman magazine is out now. As we try to do, let's pick a couple of our favourites. George, what's your pick?
Yes, so I've chosen Jill Filipovic's column on Kamala Harris. Obviously, a big talking point this week with the Democratic National Convention. We should say Freddie's there and reporting from Chicago on that. But she makes a very interesting argument, which is that Harris has learned from some of the failures of the Clinton campaign in 2016. So 2016, the Clinton campaign very much had a sort of liberal feminist air, epitomized by the slogan, "I'm with her." And she makes the point that if you look at the language that Harris and Tim Walz use, it's much more universal. They're much less wedded to identity politics, and they're framing debates such as that around abortion in broader terms about U.S. freedom. So Tim Walz has used this line on abortion, mind your own damn business. They're not making the argument that it's the main problem with the pro-life agenda is that it's sort of anti-women, it's misogynistic, because they recognize, that sort of language doesn't resonate with the electorate as much. It's an interesting article on how the Democrats are learning from some of the mistakes Clinton made and why Harris may be able to achieve what Clinton couldn't and become the first female president.
I was also struck with your interview with Sadiq Khan, which we talked about earlier in the week, how he wasn't pulling any punches. He's like, I absolutely want the Democrats to win. And he's really impressed with Tim Walz.
Yes. So it's quite a contrast with Keir Starmer and David Lammy, who've been sort of studiously neutral, as you'd expect, and saying that we'll work with whoever's president. It's no secret that Sadiq Khan and Donald Trump don't get on. And he seemed genuinely enthused by Tim Walz, as a lot of people in Labour privately are. They think he's a formidable communicator, that he's doing a very good job of expressing progressive messages in a mainstream way, and at reconnecting with working class voters.
My pick is by Phil Whitaker, who writes on health for the New Statesman. He's writing about what the case of Valdo Calocane. So this is the really tragic case, paranoid schizophrenic who killed 3 people and injured 3 more in Nottingham last year. And we've heard all week, the last couple of weeks, how there were multiple warnings that his health was deteriorating, he wasn't taking his medication, and that this could have been prevented, arguably. And what Phil does, it's fascinating. He's talking about essentially, what do you do? Where do you draw the line between patient autonomy or patient choice, their rights, and public safety? So Labour had indicated that they were keen to reform the Mental Health Act, and as part of that, it was all about strengthening patient voice. And it seems actually that, according to Phil, that Wes Streeting might start to slow down that reform now or rethink it because of what's happened here. Because, of course, patients should have a choice about how they use their own bodies and what medications they take. But he's saying up to a certain point, where your choices can harm both you as a human being and others, then maybe it's not, someone else has to step in. And obviously doctors do have a duty to do no harm. So it's a really, really thoughtful, fascinating piece by Phil Whitaker. I really recommend it.